This video is about how to prioritize and triage all of your vendor contracts. Some people have described working with vendor contracts as death by a thousand cuts. And there's a lot of truth to that. It can be overwhelming because there's so many different kinds of templates, so many different terms, so many different subjects. It's really hard to get on top of, especially when you're stretched for time. I have 4 steps that I take before I dive into a contract to make sure I understand what I'm looking for and what I should be doing. So I want to go through these with you so I can save you some time. The first one, is it a direct or indirect purchase? What that means is, are we going to be using what we're buying as part of the product or service or technology that our company is selling to someone else? In a sense, are we buying something as a customer so that we can turn around and resell it or relicense it as a vendor in some format, whether on its own or combined with other things? The ones that we are buying to resell or relicense, those are direct purchases. The other type is an indirect purchase, and that is the bucket into which everything else falls. So if it's not a direct purchase, meaning going into the product, it's an indirect purchase. The reason it's so important to understand these is because the risk scenarios and potential problems that happen are very different. Imagine having a widget and you're going to be putting it into your product you sell your consumers, and that widget catches fire easily. Now, the product you are selling has product liability issues, has potential safety issues. That's going to be very different than a product maybe that you're plugging in at your headquarters. So that's one of the reasons we think about it in this bucket of direct and indirect. So that's first one. The second question I ask, is it a good, a service, or an IP license? Commercial contracts generally fall into those 3 buckets. Often the contracts are a combination of all of them, but not always. And if you don't understand the nature of the product that's being bought or sold or licensed, you're not going to be able to know how to read the contract, how to approach the risk. Without knowing whether it's a good service or license, you're not going to be in a position to really evaluate the different provisions, the shifting of risk, the ways that the contract approaches the deal. You have to know the fundamentals. And often these concepts get a little bit mushy inside these contracts. So it'll look like it's a services contract, but you'll see there's a lot of goods included in the deliverables. Or it'll appear to be a license, it'll be called a license, but in fact, there are both goods and services being delivered under the contract. Get a handle early on about whether it's a good service or license in your contract so that you can adjust your terms appropriately. The third question I ask, is it a critical function? When we are buying products, services, or licensing technology for a critical internal corporate function, our approach should be very different than when we're purchasing something that's not as essential. For example, let's say you're purchasing an system that is going to basically be the backbone and the nerve center of your company. In those cases, you cannot accept things like suspension by the vendor because the payment's a day late. You cannot accept unilateral rights to make substantial changes to the product or the service without some input or warning from your end. So there are a lot of things that you're going to need to think about and perhaps do differently if you have the leverage and the bargaining power than you would if it was a non-essential function. So that's the third one. The final question I ask is, does this transaction create a meaningful risk for my company, either of a third party claim or some other kind of disaster that could happen down the road because of what we're talking about here? If I'm buying paper clips or office supplies, it's pretty unlikely that's going to trigger any claims, that's going to trigger any disasters for the company. But if I'm buying flammable commodities that are going to be used in manufacturing, or if the contract involves a lot of personal information that's going to be subject to data privacy rules, there's a lot of risk there. So when I'm approaching those kinds of contracts, I'm thinking a lot about those risks that I've identified and making sure my contract is addressing those. Those are the four questions I ask when I am evaluating a vendor contract and trying to triage how much time I need to spend and how closely the proposed contract matches what the deal needs to look like.